September 11th, 1697, near the Tisa River, deep in the Hungarian plains. The Ottoman army stretched for miles across the autumn grasslands, a serpent of silk and steel winding toward the river crossing at Zenta. 80,000 men, janissaries, sepahists, irregular cavalry, camp followers, artillery trains, moved in a column that seemed endless. Sultan Mustafa II himself rode among them, young and hungry for the glory that had eluded him in 2 years of inconclusive campaigning. Ahead, the Tisa glittered in the afternoon sun, shallow enough to ford, narrow enough to bridge. The Sultan's engineers had already begun constructing a pontoon bridge. By nightfall, the army would be across. By dawn, they would resume their march deeper into Habsburg territory. But the Sultan did not know that death was already watching.
Out from a ridge.
To the northwest, Habsburg cavalry scouts had spotted the Ottoman column. They had raced back with word that would change everything. The enemy was divided, vulnerable, caught in the act of crossing. And riding at the head of the Christian army was a man who never hesitated when fate offered him an opening. Prince Eugene of Savoy had found his moment. What happened in the hours that followed would not just end a campaign. It would break the myth of Ottoman invincibility, shatter an empire's forward momentum, and seal the fate of hundreds of thousands of souls along a single river bend. This is the story of the battle that drowned an army. The war had been raging for 14 years. It began in 1683 when a massive Ottoman army appeared before the walls of Vienna, the heart of the Habsburg Empire. For 2 months, the city held on by its fingernails while Europe scrambled to send relief. When King Jan Sobieski of Poland arrived with reinforcements and shattered the Ottoman siege, it marked a turning point. For the first time in generations, the tide began to flow the other way. The victory at Vienna birthed the Holy League, Austria, Poland, Venice, and eventually Russia, all bound together by the Pope's blessing and a shared determination to roll back Ottoman power. For over a decade, the League had clawed back territory: Hungary, Transylvania, parts of the Balkans. The Ottomans, who had once seemed unstoppable, now fought to hold what they had taken across centuries. But empires do not surrender easily. In 1695, a new sultan ascended the throne in Constantinople. Mustafa II was 29 years old, proud and burning with ambition to restore the glory his predecessors had lost. Unlike the sultans before him who had ruled from palaces, Mustafa chose to lead his armies personally. He would show Europe that Ottoman power was far from spent. He would reconquer Hungary, push to Vienna again if necessary, remind the world that the crescent banner still casts the longest shadow. The Sultan was intelligent, devout, and brave. But he was also impulsive, and he had inherited a military machine that was showing cracks. The Janissaries, once the terror of battlefields, had grown soft from decades of internal politics. The provincial cavalry, the sepahists, were no longer the unstoppable force they had been. Corruption plagued the officer corps, and the empire was stretched thin, fighting wars on multiple fronts from the Balkans to the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Mustafa believed willpower could overcome these weaknesses. He believed his presence would inspire his men to greatness. He believed that if he led from the front, victory would follow. He was about to learn how wrong belief could be when faced with cold tactical genius, because opposing him was a man who had spent his entire life preparing for this kind of war. Prince Eugene of Savoy was 34 years old in 1697, small in stature but towering in reputation. Born in Paris, raised in the courts of Europe, he had been rejected by King Louis XIV of France for military service, deemed too weak, too slight, too unlikely to succeed. Furious, Eugene had offered his sword to Austria instead, and Austria had given him the chance France never would. Within a decade, he had become one of the most feared commanders in Europe. He was calculating, relentless, and utterly fearless. Where other generals hesitated, Eugene struck. Where others retreated, he pressed forward. He understood terrain, timing, and the psychology of his enemies. And unlike Mustafa, who saw war as a test of faith and courage, Eugene saw it as a science, one that rewarded preparation and punished mistakes. In 1697, Eugene had been given supreme command of the Habsburg forces in Hungary. Emperor Leopold I trusted him completely, granting him the freedom to act as he saw fit. Eugene had spent the summer maneuvering carefully, avoiding major battles, preserving his smaller force while watching for an opportunity. Now in September, as the campaign season drew toward its close, that opportunity had arrived. The Ottoman campaign of 1697 had not gone as Mustafa planned. The Sultan had marched north with grand ambitions, seize key fortresses, crush the Habsburg field army, and dictate terms from a position of overwhelming strength. But Eugene had refused to give him the battle he wanted. Instead, the Habsburg general shadowed the Ottoman army, raiding supply lines, harassing stragglers, and forcing Mustafa to expend energy chasing an enemy who would not stand still. By late summer, the Sultan's frustration was mounting. His army had accomplished little. Supplies were running low. Autumn rains would soon turn the roads into mud. If he did not achieve something decisive soon, he would have to retreat and explain to Constantinople why another campaign had ended in disappointment. Mustafa decided to withdraw south for the winter, cross the Tisa River, and regroup in Ottoman-held territory. It was a sensible decision, safe, prudent, the kind of choice any reasonable commander would make. But Eugene did not intend to let him cross safely. Habsburg intelligence had been tracking the Ottoman movements closely. Scouts reported the Sultan's massive column moving toward Zenta, a small town on the north bank of the Tisa where the river could be forded. Eugene's officers calculated distances, march times, and approach routes, and the math revealed something extraordinary. If the Habsburg army moved fast enough, they could reach Zenta while the Ottomans were in the middle of crossing. An army caught mid-crossing is an army at its most vulnerable. Half its strength would be on the far bank, unable to support the half still waiting to cross. Retreat would be impossible. The river would become a wall at their backs. It struck hard and fast, such an army could be annihilated. Eugene made his decision in minutes. He would march. On September 10th, the Habsburg army began moving at forced pace toward Zenta, 50,000 men. Infantry, cavalry, artillery pushed through the Hungarian plains with a speed that exhausted horses and broke wagon axles. Eugene drove them mercilessly. Speed mattered more than rest. Surprise mattered more than caution. The terrain worked in his favor. The plains around Zenta were open, allowing rapid movement. The Tisa itself was not a massive river, perhaps 100 meters wide at the crossing point, but its banks were soft and marshy in places, and the current was strong enough to make fording dangerous. Mustafa's engineers had chosen to build a pontoon bridge to speed the crossing, but such bridges took time to construct and were fragile under pressure. Eugene's scouts rode ahead, staying hidden, watching the Ottoman camp. They reported back with precision. The bridge was half complete. The vanguard of the Ottoman army had already crossed and was setting up camp on the southern bank. The rear guard and the Sultan's headquarters remained on the north side, waiting their turn, and in between, a chaotic mass of soldiers, wagons, animals, and camp followers clogged the crossing point. It was perfect. Eugene halted his army just beyond sight of the Ottoman camp and gave his final orders. Artillery would unlimber on the high ground overlooking the river. Infantry would form assault columns. Cavalry would position on the flanks, ready to cut off any escape. The attack would begin in mid-afternoon when the sun would be in the Ottomans. Eyes in the day still had enough light for the killing to be thorough. The men rested briefly, checked weapons, whispered prayers. Many had fought the Ottomans before. They knew the Janissaries' reputation, the ferocity of the Sepaki cavalry, the sheer weight of numbers the Sultan commanded. But they also knew they were about to strike an enemy who could not strike back effectively. Eugene rode among his officers, calm and precise. His orders were simple: hit hard, hit fast, and give no quarter until the battle was won. Of his generals suggested waiting for better reconnaissance, Eugene shook his head. "We attack now," he said, "before they realize we are here, before they can form up, before they can escape." The officers saluted and returned to their units. On the far side of the ridge, the Ottoman army continued its slow, ponderous crossing. unaware that the horizon was about to explode. The first Habsburg soldiers crested the ridge at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. For a long frozen moment, both armies saw each other clearly. The Ottomans spread out across the northern bank, jammed around the bridge, half their strength already. On the far side, stopped and stared in disbelief at the long lines of infantry and cavalry emerging from the northwest. The Habsburgs, arrayed in perfect battle order, flags snapping in the wind, artillery already unlimbering, gazed down at an enemy caught in the worst possible position. Then Eugene's guns opened fire. The bombardment began with a rolling thunder that shook the ground. Cannons positioned on the ridgeline hurled iron balls into the densest concentrations of Ottoman troops. The range was short. The targets were packed tightly. The effect was catastrophic. Round shot plowed through formations, smashing men and horses into the mud. Grape shot, metal canisters filled with musket balls, burst over the massed infantry, shredding flesh and bone. Screams rose from the Ottoman lines, mingling with the frantic shouts of officers trying to impose order where there was no room to maneuver. Sultan Mustafa, who had been inspecting the bridge construction, wheeled his horse in shock. Around him, his staff scrambled for answers. How many enemy troops? How had they gotten so close undetected? What were their intentions? The answer came seconds later as Eugene's infantry began their advance. 40,000. Habsburg foot soldiers moved down the slope in disciplined columns, drums beating the cadence, pikes and muskets gleaming. They did not charge wildly. Marched, steady, relentless, a human avalanche rolling toward an enemy who could not escape. On the flanks, cavalry squadrons trotted forward, ready to sweep around and cut off retreat. The Ottoman commanders shouted desperate orders. Those units still on the north bank tried to form defensive lines, but there was no time and no space. The pontoon bridge became a choke point of panic as soldiers tried to cross both ways. Some fleeing the Habsburg assault, others trying to return. From the south bank to fight, wagons overturned, horses reared and threw their riders. Wounded men crawled toward the water, only to be trampled by those behind them. The Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry, attempted to anchor the defense. These were veteran soldiers, trained from childhood, feared across Europe for their discipline and ferocity. They formed square formations near the bridge, muskets leveled, ready to meet the Habsburg advance with volleys of fire. For a brief moment they held, pouring lead into the oncoming ranks, buying precious seconds for others to escape. But volleys could not stop what was coming. Eugene's infantry closed the distance at a steady walk, absorbing casualties without breaking stride. When they reached effective range, they halted, leveled their own muskets, and fired in controlled volleys that tore through the Janissary squares. Smoke filled the air. Men fell in heaps. The Janissaries fired back, reloaded, fired again, but they were outnumbered, outflanked, and pinned against the river. One by one, the squares collapsed. Habsburg infantry surged forward with pikes and bayonets, crashing into the disintegrating Ottoman formations. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted along a front that stretched for hundreds of meters. Pikes thrust into chests, sabers slashed at throats. Men grappled in the mud, stabbing with knives, biting, clawing, dying in piles. Behind the front line, the artillery continued its relentless work. Gunners adjusted their aim, targeting the pontoon bridge itself. Solid shots splintered the wooden planks. Direct hit severed one of the anchor ropes, and a section of the bridge swung loose, dumping dozens of soldiers into the churning water. Those who could swim struggled against the current. Those who could not went under, dragged down by armor and equipment. On the south bank, the Ottoman vanguard, perhaps 25,000 men who had already crossed, watched in helpless horror. They had no way to return. The bridge was under fire and falling apart. The river was too deep and too fast to ford under enemy artillery. Their comrades were being slaughtered within sight, and there was nothing they could do. Some Ottoman officers on the south bank considered mounting a counterattack, trying to recross and relieve the pressure, but Eugene had anticipated this. Habsburg cavalry swept along the southern riverbank, firing carbines and threatening to charge any formation that tried to approach the water. The Ottoman vanguard, leaderless and demoralized, began to drift away from the crossing, seeking safety in retreat. On the north bank, the killing intensified. Eugene had committed his cavalry. Now, squadrons of cuirassiers, heavy cavalry in breastplates and helmets, thundered into the Ottoman flanks, sabering down fleeing infantry and pursuing isolated units into the marshes. Lighter Hungarian cavalry raced ahead to cut off escape routes, forming cordons that funneled the panicked survivors back toward the killing ground. The Sultan's camp became a scene of apocalyptic chaos. Tents burned, supply wagons exploded as fire reached gunpowder stores. Slaves, servants, and camp followers fled in every direction, many running straight into Habsburg cavalry, who cut them down without hesitation. The harem tents, where the Sultan's wives and concubines traveled, were overrun. Some women threw themselves into the river rather than face capture. Others were seized as the Habsburg soldiers swept through, taking prisoners and plunder with equal efficiency. Sultan Mustafa himself was nearly killed. His bodyguards surrounded him as Habsburg cavalry closed in, forming a desperate shield of flesh and steel. Sabers rang off armor. Pistols cracked at point-blank range. The Sultan's horse was shot out from under him. He scrambled to his feet, grabbed another mount, and was hauled into the saddle by his officers. Around him, the Sublime Porte's elite guard, the Sultan's personal warriors, died holding the line. Buying seconds with their lives, a group of loyal Sipahi cavalry formed a wedge around Mustafa and charged toward the river. They crashed through a thin line of Habsburg infantry, leaving bodies behind them, and plunged into the Tisa. The current seized them immediately. Horses struggled to keep their heads above water. Men clung to saddles, to manes, to each other. Some made it across, others drowned within meters of the southern bank. Mustafa survived, barely. He emerged on the far side, soaked, shaken, and without his imperial standard. A humiliation that would haunt him for the rest of his reign. Behind him, the north bank had become a slaughterhouse. The final hour was pure massacre. With their backs to the river and no avenue of escape, the remaining Ottoman forces fought with the desperation of men who knew they were already dead. Some formed tight circles and fought until every man fell. Others broke and ran, only to be ridden down by cavalry or drowned attempting to swim. The Janissaries, those who remained, fought to the last, standing in blood-soaked mud, firing until their ammunition ran out, then swinging their muskets like clubs until Habsburg bayonets found their hearts. By the time the sun touched the western horizon, the killing had slowed, not because of mercy, but because there were so few left alive to kill. Eugene halted his infantry and pulled them back into formation. His cavalry continued mopping up isolated pockets of resistance, chasing down fleeing survivors for another hour as darkness fell. The artillery ceased fire. The battlefield went quiet except for the moans of the dying and the rush of the river. The Tisa ran red. Boadies choked. The shallows impaled against the remains of the pontoon bridge. Estimates would later suggest that 25,000 Ottomans died in the battle, perhaps more. Another 10,000 drowned, trying to escape. Thousands more were captured, including high-ranking officers, viziers, and members of the Sultan's household. The Habsburg army's casualties were astonishingly light. Perhaps 1,500 dead, mostly from the initial volleys and close-quarters fighting. Eugene walked the battlefield as night fell, surveying the destruction with the soldiers' detachment. Fire still burned in the Ottoman camp, as men were already gathering plunder, weapons, banners, horses, gold, the Sultan's personal treasury. That had been abandoned in the flight, imperial standard of the Ottoman Empire. The great horsetail banners that symbolized the Sultan's authority lay trampled in the mud. He ordered them taken as trophies. When one of his officers asked what should be done with the prisoners, Eugene's answer was curt: "Hold them. We'll ransom the officers. The rest can be sold or exchanged." He did not celebrate. He did not gloat. Simply ensured his army was ready to pursue if the opportunity arose, and then retired to his tent to write his report to the emperor. The report was brief and factual. It ended with a single line that would be repeated across Europe within days. The Sultan's army has ceased to exist. When dawn broke on September 12th, the full scale of the catastrophe became visible. The north bank of the Tisa was a graveyard. Bodies stretched from the ridgeline to the water's edge, lying in the positions where they had fallen, tangled. In death, some still clutching weapons, others frozen in gestures of prayer or surrender. Broken equipment covered the ground. Splintered pikes, shattered shields, bent swords, discarded armor. The pontoon bridge had collapsed entirely during the night, its remains drifting downstream or caught on rocks. Habsburg burial details began. The grim work of clearing the dead. Ottoman corpses were dragged into massive pits and covered with earth. Christian dead were given field burials with at least a semblance of ceremony. The wounded from both sides were sorted, treated if possible, or given mercy if they were beyond saving. Captured Ottoman banners were counted, over 100 standards, including the personal flags of several high-ranking officers. The Sultan's treasury was inventoried. Chests of gold, silver, jewels, and coins meant to pay the army for the campaign. Eugene ordered it distributed as prize money to his soldiers, rewarding the men who had delivered him this staggering victory. On the southern bank, the remnants of the Ottoman army began a long, miserable retreat. Mustafa, humiliated and furious, ordered his surviving troops to march for Ottoman territory as quickly as possible. He had lost half his army, his baggage train, his prestige, and very nearly his life. The young sultan who had ridden north with dreams of conquest now slunk homeward, with the bitter knowledge that he had led his men into a disaster of his own making. The Holy League forces did not pursue aggressively. Eugene's army was exhausted, and he knew better than to push his luck by overextending. He had achieved something rare and precious, a total, crushing, unambiguous victory. He would consolidate, resupply, and let the magnitude of what had happened sink in across Europe. News of Zenta spread like wildfire. Within weeks, every court in Europe knew the details. In Vienna, Emperor Leopold ordered celebrations and public prayers of thanksgiving. In Rome, the Pope declared a day of jubilation. In Warsaw, Venice, and Moscow, capitals of the Holy League, church bells rang and people danced in the streets. The Ottoman Empire, which had cast its shadow over Europe for centuries, had been dealt a wound it could not hide and could not ignore. In Constantinople, the news struck like a thunderbolt. Mustafa returned to a capital seething with anger and recrimination. How could the Sultan, who led the armies personally, have allowed such a catastrophe? Ministers whispered, generals pointed fingers, janissaries decimated and demoralized, muttered about incompetence and dishonor. Mustafa would never recover his reputation. Though he remained sultan for several more years, his power was broken. The confidence that had driven him to lead armies himself was shattered along the banks of the Tisa. And the Ottoman Empire's long retreat from Europe, which had begun at Vienna in 1683, became irreversible after Zenta in 1697. 2 years later, the exhausted belligerents would meet at Karlowitz to negotiate peace. The Ottomans would surrender vast territories, Hungary, Transylvania, Podolia, ceding lands that had been under their control for generations. It was the first time in Ottoman history that the empire signed a treaty not as a conqueror dictating terms, but as a defeated power begging for peace. The age of Ottoman expansion into Europe was over. Prince Eugene of Savoy, the slight, soft-spoken general whom France had rejected, became the most celebrated commander of his generation. He would go on to win more victories, fight more wars, and shape European history for decades to come. But Zenta remained his masterpiece. The battle where perfect timing, ruthless execution, and an enemy's fatal mistake combined to produce a victory so complete, it changed the trajectory of empires. On a quiet bend of the Tisa River where autumn, grass now grows over unmarked graves, the silence remembers what happened. An army marched across a river. A general saw his moment. And when the sun set, the map of Europe had been redrawn in blood.